Oke, berikut akan saya paparkan mengenai lensa. Kita mulai dari struktur lensa. Ada bodi lensa, kaca, cincin fokus, jadi nanti ada ring untuk memfokuskan objek, dan cincin focal length untuk menentukan jarak focal length, dan cincin diafragma. Nah, ini biasanya cincin diafragma ini kita temui dalam kamera analog. Nah, dalam kamera digital hampir sama, cuma nanti bedanya terdapat tombol autofocus dan tombol image stabilizer. Oke, ini kita mulai untuk jenis lensa. Yang pertama, lensa normal memiliki panjang titik api antara 45 hingga 55 mm. Ini memiliki sudut pandang yang paling mendekati mata manusia, yaitu sekitar 45 derajat, sehingga disebut lensa normal. Oke, berikutnya jenis lensa tele. Lensa ini cenderung untuk memotret objek yang berjauhan, biasanya untuk motret olahraga atau motret yang lokasi antara pemotret dan objeknya jauh. Lensa ini mulai dari 70 mili hingga 300 mili. Ini kita temui untuk memotret di alam bebas, untuk memotret burung misalnya, atau di pertandingan-pertandingan olahraga biasanya. Nah, ini untuk teman-teman yang suka memotret landscape, lensa ini cocok karena lensa ini memiliki sudut lebar. Jenis lensa ini mempunyai sudut pandang yang lebih lebar dari 45 derajat. Jadi nanti teman-teman ketika memotret, untuk motret landscape di alam, motret hamparan dan segala macam, lensa ini cocok karena akan menampilkan view yang lebih lebar. Nah, berikutnya lensa mata ikan atau fish eye lensa. Lensa yang berbentuk cembung seperti mata ikan. Lensa super wide, jadi ketika teman-teman ingin motret yang sangat melebar, bisa menggunakan lensa ini. Namun nanti hasilnya agak sedikit distorsi, melengkung. Titik apinya ada yang 15 mili, 16, dan 8 mili. Nah, berikutnya lensa makro. Ini untuk motret barang yang kecil-kecil, benda kecil. Misalnya teman-teman ingin motret serangga atau motret perhiasan yang kecil, pakai lensa makro ini cocok untuk mendapatkan hasil yang maksimal. Dalam fotografi, acap kali kita mendengar istilah yang namanya focal length. Nah, focal length itu apa sih sebenarnya? Teman-teman dapat menyimak video berikut mengenai focal length.
What is focal length? Focal length, usually represented in millimeters, is a basic description of a photographic lens. The measurement is not the length of the lens itself, but actually a calculation of the optical distance from where all light rays converge inside the lens to the image sensor of the camera. So a lens with a focal length of 24 millimeters, for example, would have light range coverage 24 millimeters above the image sensor. The focal length number tells us the angle of view, how much of the scene will be captured, and the magnification, how large a subject will appear. The lower the number, the wider the field of view and lower the magnification, increasing the amount of the scene that our camera can see. The larger the number, the narrower the field of view, and greater the magnification, decreasing the amount of the scene our camera can see. It's also worth noting that oftentimes photographers will refer to larger focal lengths as longer and smaller focal lengths as shorter. While the lens you attach to your camera comes with a focal length, depending on the type of camera you attach to it, its focal length can actually vary. Back in the days of film, 35mm film was the standard sensor size of all types of photography. Once film cameras left the scene, digital cameras replaced them with many different sized sensors, the majority of them smaller. 50mm lenses regarded as a standard focal length for film became a short telephoto on the new smaller sensor cameras. This is due to something called crop factor. Full-frame cameras do not have any crop factor, since they operate on a standard 35mm format used in the days of film. APS-C sensors, however, have a crop factor of 1.5 for Nikon or 1.6 for Canon. What this means is any lens attached to an APS-C camera will need to have its focal length multiplied by either 1.5 or 1.6 to get its effective focal length. The actual focal length of the lens remains unchanged, but switching camera bodies that have different sensor sizes will change what the picture will look like. For example, if I have a 50mm lens on a full-frame camera, its effective focal length will be 50mm. But if I swap it to a crop sensor camera with a crop factor of 1.5, the effective focal length suddenly becomes 75mm. There are other camera form factors as well, but full-frame APS-C cameras are most common. When considering a lens, there are a number of categories defined by ranges of focal lengths. The widest lenses are the fisheye or ultra-wide lenses. These lenses have focal ranges from 8mm to 24mm. They are limited in use and typically used for landscape or architecture. They create such a wide angle of view that images can sometimes appear distorted, and they are not suitable for all portraits since they make facial features look distorted. Next comes regular wide-angle lenses, with focal lengths typically between 24mm to 35mm. This is where distortion stops appearing unnatural. Standard lenses with focal lengths between 35mm to 70mm produce images that most closely reproduce what our eyes see. They are great walk-around lenses and very popular. Telephoto lenses typically start around 70mm and end around 300mm. Portrait lenses fall in this range, and as you increase focal length, telephoto compression will cause foreground and background objects to appear close together. Extreme telephoto lenses round out the bunch with focal lengths exceeding 300mm. These lenses are used for wildlife and situations where extreme magnification is required. Within these categories lie prime and zoom lenses. Prime lenses are lenses that have a fixed focal length. They are often simpler lenses, making them easier to manufacture and in return cost less and usually are of higher quality than zoom lenses. Zoom lenses, on the other hand, cover a range of focal lengths and because of their versatility allow you to carry, say, one lens instead of 2 or 3 to cover the same focal range. The only drawbacks are the increased cost and slightly reduced quality from manufacturing something so complex. Focal length is a simple concept, but an important one. By the end of this video, you will have learned the principles of focal length and the various categories of lenses that together will help you make an informed decision on which lenses to purchase and how focal length will affect your picture. Subscribe to Apple Apps for more animations every month, and as always, thank you for watching.
Nah, kurang lebih ketika kita membicarakan kamera, ya kita akan berbicara mengenai bodi kamera. Bodi kamera itu yang ini. Ini bodinya, ini lensanya. Kalau cuma bodi aja, ya tidak bisa buat memotret karena, kalau cuma bodi aja nggak bisa buat memotret karena yang akan berperan banyak ada di lensa. Lensa lah yang akan memfokuskan, lensa yang akan mengecilkan, mengerucutkan, melebarkan daya jangkau. Kalau cuma begini masuk ke sensor sini, ke mirror, ya tidak bisa berfungsi dengan baik. Gambar yang didapat pun juga tidak maksimal. Nah, lensa inilah nanti akan banyak komponennya, akan banyak hal-hal yang perlu kita pelajari. Tapi di lensa digital, kalau di lensa digital, semua kita mengaturnya akan lewat monitor. Nah, lensa juga fungsinya sama, cuma di lensa kalau kamera digital tidak sebanyak angka-angka di kamera manual. Di kamera digital, di lensa ya cuma ada angka mengenai titik api, focal length, tapi tidak ada mengatur diafragma di sini, diafragma diatur di sini. Jadi prinsip kerjanya itu sama. Ada aperture, diafragma, ada kecepatan, ada jarak titik api dan segala macamnya. Terus prinsipnya sama, cuma lokasinya akan berbeda-beda setiap kamera antara manual dan digital. Nah, apa itu aperture? Teman-teman dapat menyimak video berikut ini.
What is aperture? Perhaps the most influential parameter of photography, aperture plays an important role in composition and setting up a shot. Let's take a closer look. Simply put, aperture is the hole in the lens through which light travels into the camera body and onto the camera sensor. To understand, let's look at the human eye. All cameras are designed like human eyes. The cornea of our eye is similar to the front element of the lens, gathering light and bending it inward toward the iris. The iris can expand or shrink, controlling the size of the pupil, which passes light into the inner eye. The pupil is what we refer to as the aperture in photography. The amount of light that falls onto the retina is determined by the size of the pupil. The larger the pupil, the more light falls onto the retina. The larger the aperture of the lens, the more light enters the camera. The iris of the lens controls the size of the aperture and is called the diaphragm. The diaphragm's function is to block all light with the exception of the light that goes through the aperture. In photography, aperture is expressed in f numbers, also known as f-stops. F-stops are a way of describing how open or closed the aperture is. The smaller the f-stop means a larger aperture, while a larger f-stop means a smaller aperture. This can be tricky to remember since large f-stops mean small aperture sizes. So an f-stop of f1.4 is larger than f2.8 and much larger than f8 or f11. Aside from controlling the amount of light passing through the lens and into the camera, the aperture has a direct impact on the depth of field, the area of the image that appears sharp. A large f number such as f16 will bring all foreground and background objects into focus, while a small f number such as f1.4 will isolate either the foreground or background objects and make everything else blurry. Every lens has a limit on how large or small the aperture can get. If you take a look at the specifications of your lens, it should indicate the maximum apertures, lowest f numbers, and minimum apertures, highest f numbers. The maximum aperture of the lens is much more important than the minimum aperture because it shows the speed of the lens. Lenses with apertures of f1.4 or f2.8 are considered fast lenses because they can pass more light into the camera than, for example, a lens with a maximum aperture of f4 or f5.6. That's the reason night photography usually requires fast lenses. The minimum aperture of a lens is usually not important and should rarely be used as diffraction will cause the image to lose clarity. It is also worth noting the two types of lenses, primes and zooms. Prime lenses have a fixed focal length, meaning they cannot zoom without physically moving closer or further away from the subject. Zoom lenses give you the flexibility for you to zoom in or out of an object while remaining stationary. While prime lenses will have a fixed maximum aperture, the maximum aperture of a zoom lens will often get smaller as the focal length increases. These lenses are called variable aperture lenses. This is important because for a zoom lens with a focal length of 70 to 200 millimeters, the aperture may increase from f3.5 to f5.6, decreasing the amount of light entering the camera. Because aperture controls the amount of light entering the camera, it also affects other parameters such as ISO and shutter speed. A larger aperture or smaller f number will let more light into the camera, allowing you to use a faster shutter speed or lower ISO value. This is beneficial to eliminate motion blur and reduce the amount of noise that your camera will produce if its ISO gets bumped up. Faster shutter speeds can be essential in scenes with lots of motion, like sports and wildlife photography. So a fast lens can help increase your shutter speed or decrease your ISO value if your shutter speed is set to a specific value. Fast lenses are also imperative for any kind of nighttime photography. Whether you're taking pictures of the Milky Way or doing a moonlit photo shoot, large apertures will let as much light in as possible. Small apertures can be useful as well. Shooting landscape scenes requires everything in crisp focus, so smaller apertures will sharpen any out-of-focus areas that may come about. To enable manual adjustment of aperture values, set your camera to either aperture priority or manual mode. Aperture priority will let you change aperture values manually, while leaving shutter speed and ISO up to the camera's internal metering system. Manual mode lets you control every aspect of the camera, allowing you to change ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. I personally leave my camera in aperture priority mode 99% of the time for most types of photography. With all this information, you should be able to start using your lenses and cameras to the best of their ability. Aperture is probably the most stylistic setting you can change on your camera, allowing for unique effects that can take your images to the next level.
Oke, saya kira cukup ya pemaparan mengenai kamera. Untuk selebihnya nanti teman-teman kita saling bisa bertukar referensi karena tentu saja ketika bicara mengenai perkembangan, mengenai sejarah, mengenai periode akan sangat banyak sekali bahasanya. Tapi karena di mata kuliah fotografi dasar, maka ya kita harus berbagi pertemuan dengan materi-materi yang lain. Nah, pada pertemuan berikutnya saya akan membahas mengenai sejarah fotografi di Indonesia, sejarah foto jurnalistik di Indonesia. Kenapa ada kata jurnalistiknya? Karena foto pertama kali yang dihasilkan ketika Republik ini mau merdeka atau ketika Republik ini merdeka adalah foto jurnalistik, ketika foto itu dimediakan di media massa. Nah, oke. Sampai bertemu di video selanjutnya. Saya akan membahas mengenai fenomena fotografi, sejarah fotografi di Indonesia, foto jurnalistik. Nanti kita akan bahas mengenai menurut bersaudara. Oke, selamat siang.